Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Gaming with me, Tony Mo, and I'm here today to bring you my thoughts, basically my review of Titanfall 2's single-player campaign. Now, Respawn had a pretty big challenge set before them when they set out to develop Titanfall 2. They had to look back and figure out why their multiplayer component that had been so well received initially and so well critiqued by critics simply hadn't been able to maintain any sort of a community. It didn't really have any life after the first 4 months. Respawn had to figure out why, and they had to consider what they could do this time around to build something that would last longer. But that was just one piece of the puzzle, because they were now looking to set out and develop a single-player campaign to expand, to open up Titanfall's universe for the very first time. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, when I wrapped up my time with TF2's single-player campaign, I couldn't help but draw comparisons to Halo 2. When it came to just FPS memories, Halo 2 kept flooding back to me. It's not that they're identical, they're obviously not, and they really don't share a lot of similarities when it comes to their core gameplay design, but their overall presentation is very similar. Here's why. Halo 2, and many of the early Halo games, even many of the late Halo games, have always been really exceptional at delivering pacing, variety, and diversity when it comes to gameplay, story, the different scenarios that they thrust the player into. You've got vehicle combat, you've got on-foot combat, you've got combat in the air, you've got combat in space, you've got zero-G combat, you've got all these different enemy types that you're engaging. That's kind of at the core of what made Halo's gameplay so kick-ass back then. Tied in with a pretty compelling and awesome story if you're into sci-fi stuff like that, and you're ready to rock and roll. That's how I feel about Titanfall 2's campaign. It may lack some of the enemy diversity and difficulty that Halo can have when you really ramp things up to Legendary, but all in all, it has great pacing, it has variety in gameplay, and it has a compelling story, again, that is full of gooey sci-fi goodness. If you like science fiction, if you like first-person shooters, and if you like mechs, you're going to love what Titanfall 2 single player has to offer. So let's actually start by talking about the story a little bit more. Now, the overarching story, the thing that draws you from one point to the next, that gives you objectives to constantly complete from start to finish of the game's campaign, is really the same type of story you might see in a Star Wars film. You've got the good guys who are considered outlaws, the militia, and the bad guys, the IMC, this sort of, massive corporation, entity that has now developed a weapon of mass destruction, looking to use it to destroy not just the militia, but other peoples as well. So, of course, you have to stop them. That's the overarching story. Again, the main story that's on display, I think the primary engagement point for the player, is the relationship between you, as former rifleman turned pilot Jack Cooper, and his new Titan, or his new Titan AI, BT. That's the relationship that was really advertised by Respawn in all of their trailers, and that's really what everybody's been talking about. A lot of people, this could be this really great buddy experience, and you know what it is? It reminds me, again, to reference Halo, a lot of the Master Chief and Cortana relationship, albeit two completely different personalities. Jack Cooper is nothing like Master Chief, well, for the most part, and BT isn't quite as ultra-intelligent as Cortana. In fact, BT reminds me a lot of Commander Data from Star Trek The Next Generation. He's very calculated, he still has his AI wits about him.
3 days ago. We know there are militia survivors out there.
That's longer than any relationship I've had.
Noted.
And he takes everything, very serious and very by the book. He doesn't understand figures of speech, he doesn't understand metaphors for the most part. This, though, is really, I think, at the heart of what makes their relationship so good. It's why it's so fun to watch, Jean-Luc Picard communicate with Data, or Geordi communicate with Data. Pretty much anyone communicate with Data, right? A lot of the entertainment value, a lot of the smile-inducing moments comes from, I don't want to say his ignorance, but again, just the way that Data looks at things. Very calculated. So you have to explain to him what a figure of speech is. And more often than not in Star Trek, they use that as a setup and payoff. So you get the comedy of that person, of Data in this instance, taking something very seriously, and then you get the additional layer of comedy when it's finally explained to Data, and then he uses it in his own manner. There's a lot of similar setup and payoffs between Jack Cooper and BT. The best part is, Respawn introduced this really intelligent dialogue selection system. So there are multiple instances throughout the game's campaign where you can choose how you communicate with BT as Jack Cooper. You usually are given 2 choices. You can select one, sometimes you can select both, and you can always select none, but I strongly recommend you pick one. It allows you to feel like you have some control over how Cooper communicates with BT, almost to some degree influencing how you experience who Jack Cooper is from a personality perspective. But it's these moments that have a lot of emotional value. They don't have any long-term like payoff. This isn't BioWare, this isn't a Mass Effect game. You're not altering the path of the story or the relationship, but it does provide in-the-moment value.
Somebody's in love.
A human's concept of love requires admiration, attraction, devotion, and respect. Conclusion: I am 50% in love.
It brings BT to life in a big way. And just halfway through the campaign, as a player, I'm already like, BT buddy, man, yes, you and me, we're gonna save the world. It's strong. It's really well done. That, I think, is at the heart of the story experience inside of Titanfall 2. That is the driving point. Without that relationship between Jack Cooper and BT, the game would not be as engaging as it is. No doubt about that. Now, there are plenty of other characters, antagonists and protagonists, specifically the Apex Predators mercenary group that are working for the IMC. These are the main bad guys. You're going to deal with them more than you directly deal with the IMC when it comes to character and story development. They each have their own screen time, some more than others, and what I really liked was the setup, I guess you could say, to what turns out to be each of these boss fights. So you have the members of this mercenary group. They each have their own Titan chassis, and eventually you'll engage in Titan versus Titan combat with those Titan chassis. This makes up the boss fight segment of the game from start to finish.
You were not invited to Kane's party, and that's why you're dead. Well, another runaway hero with an SRS Vanguard class Titan. Woo! Now we're talking. Bring a knife to a knife fight. Let's get this party started.
Now, those fights have some element of uniqueness to them because, again, they're dealing with different chassis, so you have to counter them by selecting a different loadout as BT. You get small moments of introduction to these characters, whether it's over a loudspeaker or whether it's through them playing mind games with you. One of the mercenaries in particular actually throws you into a training simulation before finally realizing that the only way they're going to defeat you is to go head-to-head with you. Again, there's a lot of great setup and payoff with each of these Apex Predators mercenaries. Now, there are other characters and other groups spattered throughout the game. You run into, eventually you get to work alongside of an elite group of pilots once you make your way back to the militia. And, you know, they're only on screen for a brief moment, but they're really well presented. They remind me a lot of the ODSTs that you run into throughout the course of Halo's campaign, albeit probably a little bit more fleshed out than most of those guys were. And it gives a lot of value to each and every situation when you always have some emotional point, no matter how small, to the characters that are on screen fighting alongside of you or fighting against you. It's a really strong area for Titanfall 2 across the board, and again, it provides a lot of value for the campaign from start to finish. Let's go a little bit more in depth with the gameplay experience on offer here. Obviously, you can have the best story, the best, voiceovers, the best dialogue. Without great gameplay, a first-person shooter simply cannot be great. Fortunately, Titanfall 2 has some pretty outstanding gameplay. And much like I mentioned earlier when I drew that comparison to Halo 2, it's really well paced. It has a lot of variety. There's a lot of diversity. Not just across each mission, but within the missions themselves. One of the ways that Respawn has done this is, I think, by respecting the two core elements that make Titanfall Titanfall. So, Titans, obviously, making sure that the Titan gameplay is outstanding, in which it definitely is. I think it's one of the game's strongest points is when you're in a Titan dealing with other Titans, whether it's a boss fight or a more large scale, like, Titan on Titan militia versus IMC battle. That's where the game is really kicking ass. It feels awesome to be in a Titan, and it requires a little bit more focus, I think, than being on foot. You really have to coordinate. You have to consider the different loadouts that you have as BT. You have to assess the situation, find out which one works best, and that's how you're going to come out on top. It's a more tactical experience than the experience that's on offer when you're on foot. The experience on foot is just as good though. It's super fast, high-paced gameplay, and again, Respawn's respecting all of the wonderful abilities you have as a pilot. You know, this well-honed, well-trained master of the battlefield with incredible speed, wall-running capabilities, and just really great awareness. You know, they always respect that, and that's always at the core of your gameplay experience when you're boots on the ground, or boots on a wall in this instance. But there's so much more going on. You're never spending too much time engaging targets directly with your weapon. You're spending a lot of time doing a multitude of things. You're in combat while also navigating a level via, you know, extreme platforming segments. You're using puzzle solving, environmental puzzle solving to get from one point to the other while also engaging with combat. You've got entire missions that just go off the cuff that are dedicated to things like time travel, that are dedicated to entire segments of hardcore high-speed platforming while also, again, solving puzzles. They keep mixing it up. You know, it's a super varied campaign, and the set pieces go from small scale to exceptionally large scale. The game gets really cinematic in a lot of different situations from start to finish, and it does so without ever truly removing control from the player. This is, I think, one of the biggest things for me when it came to Titanfall 2's campaign. And the reason I refer to Halo, I think more often, for more reason than any other reason, the reason I've even been making references to Half-Life, you know, pretty much to all of the greatest FPSs from 10, 15 years ago, is that that was a point in time when developers made cinematic moments and they built them directly into the gameplay. They didn't need to pull control away from the player. They needed to force you to watch some drawn-out 15-minute cinematic to give you the feeling that you were in a cinematic situation, you know, to have that feeling of epicness, of grandeur. They did that all through the straight-up gameplay moments. Titanfall 2 has some small cinematic moments here, but for the most part, it's like they sat down at the drawing board and they said, okay, here's all of our cinematics we want to make. Let's take 99% of those and turn those into actual player-controlled gameplay experiences, and still make sure that they have that cinematic value. That's Titanfall 2 in a nutshell. You know, they never fully remove control from the player. One of my favorite moments in the game is when we're already in a ridiculously large-scale, wonderful environment. We're chasing a spaceship in orbit, or I should say in atmosphere, you know, at super high speeds. We got another pilot squad with us from the militia. We're rolling together. BT's there, and BT and I are engaging a mercenary pilot, and he ends up going, you know, like melee combat with this pilot, and I'm thinking I'm just going to lay on my side, you know, practically sliding off this spaceship, watching this battle, but that's not at all what happens. I end up being engaged in the battle. I'm on foot, and I'm helping BT eliminate this target. It's wonderful, and that is really how Respawn treats cinematics throughout the entire length of the campaign. Even when they do take control away from you because you're, you know, for some good reason usually, you're actually disabled as a player, they still allow you to look around. You're never forced to look at things. You're always allowed to really examine the situation from your own perspective. That has a huge amount of value. And I think it's very interesting when you look at who's developing Titanfall 2. Who's the team behind Respawn? Oh yeah, it's the same people who really started that big cinematic trend with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4. That was a game that had so much cinematic value to it, but that, more often than not, allowed the player to have full control. I mean, just consider All Gillied Up, you know, sitting in the grass in real time as enemies walk just next to you. One of the most memorable first-person shooter missions in a video game ever. And there's some pretty badass moments in Titanfall 2 that I think deserve to be among the ranks of some of the greatest first-person shooter missions, including All Gillied Up. If the game's combat has one weak point, I would say it's a lack of true enemy diversity. They throw different enemy types at you, but they never feel really engaging. You know, we see the different specters, we see the grunts, we see these drones that fly in the air, we even have some IMC pilots that, or I should say soldiers that show up with, like, you know, shields that they deploy. But because of the freedom, because of your abilities as a pilot, they never present a real challenge. I would have liked to see enemy types that perhaps deploy stasis fields to shut down your jump kit, to prevent you from wall running. You know, why doesn't the IMC have technology to counter pilots to some degree? I would think that that's something that they would have, and that really would have ramped up the difficulty without just making you more squishy or just making enemies do more damage. That's one of the game's few weaknesses that I would love to see them expand on moving into the future. Whether you're in a Titan or whether you're on foot, though, there is an incredible amount of truly memorable moments in the Titanfall 2 campaign. There are specific missions that I'm going to talk about for years to come. It's an outstanding, incredibly well-presented, gooey, wonderful sci-fi FPS experience that you should not miss out on. If you like science fiction, if you like first-person shooters, if you like mechs, there's no reason not to pick up Titanfall 2. Even if you just play the single player, I think it's worth it. You'll get about 6 hours out of the harder difficulty. If you're skilled, master difficulty, probably going to take you 7, maybe even 8 hours. There's collectibles, there's replayability, and maybe, just maybe, after experiencing the universe and, you know, opening up the can of worms that hopefully will be so much more for the world of Titanfall, you might find yourself interested in the game's multiplayer, and I think that's just what Respawn intended. A beautiful, just audio-visual masterpiece from start to finish. Don't skip out on Titanfall. If there's one first-person shooter you buy this year, this holiday, make it TF2. If you guys have any other questions or concerns for me, feel free to throw them down in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.